r/nosleep. Posted by you/helpcreepylandlady. My landlady is acting really creepy and I don't know what to do. Part 2. Thank you so much for all of your concern and sorry I haven't been able to respond to everyone individually. I have been reading all of the comments and taking your advice seriously. It's been an enormous help and has forced me to realize that my safety is much more important than my belongings or even my university degree. To follow on from my previous post, I received a strange text message from my landlady's mobile which read, "From what I gathered in the comments, this doesn't necessarily mean thank you for asking me to eat, it can also mean thank you for treating me to dinner. I'm still at my boyfriend's house at the moment and I've finally heard from one of my housemates." Someone else in the comments made the connection between this statement and my newly bought groceries, which I left behind when I hot-footed it out of that nightmare house. Initially I assumed that the homeless person or whoever it is that has my landlady's mobile phone had hopefully eaten the food and perhaps moved on. My main concern swiftly switched to my housemates, since I had just discovered our landlady had passed away and we had been living in the house illegally. I spoke with the police officer briefly about it and he said that, since we'd paid for the month, we'd be permitted to stay in the house until the end of the month, literally a few days away, but then we'd have to collect our stuff and find somewhere else to go. Today I updated my housemates on the situation, but up until midday I had only heard back from the one who's back in New Zealand with his family. He's obviously feeling quite shell-shocked and I told him I was categorically not going back to the house until I heard from the police, but I said that I could arrange to have his stuff picked up once we get the all clear, to save him cutting his family visit short. I still hadn't back from one housemate at this point, an 18-year-old kid who, from what I gathered, was kicked out by his parents and was living in the smallest room in the house, but I did hear from my other housemate today at around 5 p.m. My other housemate is originally from Poland, so his English is okay but not brilliant. When I first mentioned what had happened to him, he didn't really seem to understand and all he could really grasp was that our landlady had been in an accident. I wasn't sure whether this was because he didn't understand my message or because it was just too unbelievable for him. Anyway, he called me at about 5 p.m. and told me that, after receiving my message on Friday night he had decided to go stay at his sister's flat, she lives in the west of the city, and discuss with her about finding a new place to live. It turns out he knew that we were living there illegally and he was concerned that he might be implicated in some way. He'd decided to return to the house today to pick up some of his belongings, and that's when I got the call from him. When he was on the phone, I could hear this unholy din in the background and I asked him what was going on. His room is directly below our landlady's and he said the noise was coming from the room above. Apparently whoever is up there has been scrabbling around, making these erratic thumping noises and scratching sounds intermittently since he's been there. At the point when he called me, he'd locked his door and was too scared to leave the room. I felt so guilty, wondering whether I should have been firmer with my warnings and telling him categorically not to go back to the house in my previous message. His room has a window that looks out onto the road, so I asked him to see if there was a police car outside. He looked for quite a while and said there was a police car parked on the road, but it was quite far up from our house and could be dealing with something further up the road. At this point I was pretty livid, since the police officer I spoke to on Saturday had assured me that officers would be sent to the house Saturday night. I told my housemate that I'd call the police and get back to him as soon as possible. I could hear the noise upstairs getting louder and it sounded as though my housemate was on the verge of tears at this stage. My heart sunk and I felt awful hanging up on them. Just as I was about to call the police, I received a text message from my landlady saying, "My name. I've become pretty adept at writing Chinese characters into Google Translate now and this translation was pretty clear. It says come." With my housemate still trapped in his room, I knew immediately that this must be some sort of threat. I phoned the police and gave them all of the details about the situation, including the name of the officer I spoke to, but all the dispatcher told me was that they would call me back. I begged them to tell me what had happened with the officers they sent to the house, if they ever sent any at all, and send some officers to the house now to help my housemate, but she said that she couldn't disclose any information about the case without the officers' permission and that she'd take my housemate's mobile number to confirm what was happening. I felt completely helpless. I phoned my housemate back to tell them what had happened, but by this point the noise upstairs was so loud that I could barely hear him and he were literally weeping down the phone. All I could hear him say was, "My name, I'm gonna die. She's gonna kill me. Please. Please." Over and over again. I know this sounds incredibly rash, but I couldn't just leave him there. I explained the situation to my boyfriend and, against my better judgment, we drove back to the house. It was about a half-hour drive and, In that time, I practically chewed my nails down to the bed. The only weapons we had with us were a kitchen knife from my boyfriend's house, a large flashlight, and a cricket bat from one of his housemates. When I opened that door, I felt my heart jump into my throat. The light bulb must have burned out, because the downstairs hallway was now completely bathed in darkness. Immediately to my left, I could see that my housemate's door was wide open. It looked like it had been literally torn open. There were scratch marks all around the door handle and huge chunks of the wood had been ripped off. Then I heard it. That same guttural noise, like someone choking on water. "My name, Gwilaj," it whispered. Whatever I had encountered on that Friday night, it was stood at the top of the stairs, wearing my landlady's nightgown. Its disfigured face was obscured by the dark, and its pale hands were draped over my housemate's chest as he gaped at me in fear. I will never forget his face, contorted in sheer agony. As I squinted in the darkness, I could see the nightgown billowing out from behind my housemate. I could see it, hanging inches off the floor. There, in the corridor, clutching my housemate, whatever this thing was. It was floating in the air. I immediately shouted to my boyfriend to pass me the flashlight and I shone it directly at them both. It let out a piercing shriek and slithered back into the blackness of the upper hallway, dragging my housemate with it. In that brief flicker of light, I saw its face. This was no homeless person. This was not even close to being human. Its luminously pale skin, tinted with shades of blue. Its long black hair draped like thick weeds across its back. Its eyes like balls of fire. Its mouth a twisted mass of bare white teeth and raw red flesh. That claw wrapped around my housemate's chest. I backed out of the house just in time to hear the sirens. After failing to connect with my housemate's phone and after reading the case notes, the dispatcher had decided to send officers to the address after all. The rest of what happened feels like a blur. I heard the officers rush past me, batons raised and powerful flashlights at the ready. They combed the house for my housemate and that thing, but found no one. All I remember after that is sitting on the pavement, clutching a cup of tea, with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I wasn't cold, but I couldn't stop shivering. I couldn't even find the strength to cry. The officer who I had spoken to on Saturday finally showed up at around 8 p.m. and approached me. He told me that they'd sent officers to the house on Saturday evening and that these officers had encountered my other 18-year-old housemate. They'd searched the house and found nothing, so they naturally assumed that whoever had broken in had already stolen what they wanted and left. Apparently, they had advised my 18-year-old housemate to get anything of value from my room and, if it was open, the New Zealand housemate's room and lock it in his room in case the perpetrator came back. Then they left, and no one has heard from the kid since. He wasn't there when they checked the house today, and there's no sign that he packed a bag to leave. I've only just gotten back to my boyfriend's house and my head is a mess. With the officer's help, I was able to retrieve some of my belongings from my house, but it's a small comfort. I can't get the image of that thing out of my head. What happened to my housemates? And why didn't the police find anything? I have to believe that, whatever that thing is, it's still there and it's hiding them somewhere. I have to help them somehow. For all of you who have been following me on this journey, I'm so sorry that I have misled you. I have a confession to make. In my first post, I wasn't telling the entire truth. I have covered up certain facts that now, I am beginning to realize, are integral to getting myself out of this situation. I have dreamt of that haunting figure in my old house since the incident on Sunday and I can't keep quiet any longer. In order to really explain why I lied, I need to give some background on my relationship with my landlady. When I first moved in last year, we were on good terms and maintained a friendly relationship until this year. In that time, I got to know a bit about my landlady and her background. As far as I know, she's never married and has no children, but she has 2 brothers and a sister who all still live in China. She's always been very secretive about why she moved to the UK alone, so I never pressed the issue. From what I can gather, her extended family are quite poor and she regularly sends money back to them. At the start of the year, she confided in me that one of her grandnephews had just been diagnosed with leukemia and the family was struggling to keep up with the medical bills. She then immediately told me that she'd be raising the rent, quite substantially, because she needed to send more money back to help with her grandnephew's treatment. Since my room was the largest one in the house, I was going to be the hardest hit. I was immediately skeptical about the story surrounding her grandnephew, particularly since it came right before the conversation about the rent. I thought it was just a sob story she could use as an excuse to hike up her rent and make a tidy profit. I told her categorically that I couldn't afford it, and this understandably caused a rift between us. Our relationship degenerated quickly during the first few weeks of January and eventually devolved to us having loud arguments in the hallway whenever we crossed paths. She was afraid that I would become a squatter, and I in turn was afraid that she would turf me out last minute, leaving me with no place to live. My boyfriend's place is too far out for me to commute to university. The situation escalated past the point of reconciliation, and, on the night I wrote my first post, it had reached fever pitch. This is the point where the real story diverges from what I wrote in my original post. I was not innocuously asking if my boyfriend could stay over, nor was I the first one to initiate contact. On that Thursday, someone at work had clearly tampered with my landlady's lunch or eaten it, because I got a text from her at around 3 p.m. saying, "Where's my lunch? You think this funny?" I replied telling her that I hadn't done anything to her food, but she didn't believe me and kept accusing me of lying. The conversation devolved into her calling me some expletives, and I returned the favor. This texting spree spanned several hours, since she was at work and was only checking her phone intermittently. By about 6 p.m., she finally sent her ultimatum. In her own words, "You pay higher rent cost, or you get out my house tonight." I was overcome with a mixture of anger and panic. It was in this weird haze of emotions that I said something that I now deeply regret. What's the point in paying so much for all of this treatment if your grandnephew is just going to die anyway? I shuddered with contempt, disgusted with myself for saying something so heinous, but equally inflated with a sense of self-righteousness against my money-grubbing landlady. Everything I said about the storm was true, and, when my landlady called me at around 7 p.m., the suddenly vibration of my phone did startle me. I was reluctant to pick up the phone, as I knew I was in the wrong, but I was still a mess of fear and rage. I answered the phone to a cacophony of abuse from my understandably outraged landlady, but, rather than concede, I decided to argue back. It is not something I'm proud of. She must have been on her way to her car, because I could hear the rain in the background and the heavy sound of her footsteps. We must have been arguing for about 10 minutes before she suddenly paused. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then I heard her get hit by the car. I heard her scream, heard the crunch of her bones under the wheel, and the screech of tires as the driver tore away from the scene. I heard her weeping and begging for help, her cries smothered by a torrent of raindrops. And I hung up on her. I had no idea where she was or what to do, but I felt somehow that I might be implicated in the accident or she would find some way to blame me. So I went back to my computer, I put my headphones in, and I kept right on working. It wasn't until about 9 p.m. that I finally mustered up the courage to send her a text reading, "Are you alright?" From then on, the story is the same. The creepy responses, the scratching on my door, the menacing whispers. All of that was true. Deep down, I knew she was dead long before the police officer told me. I knew from the moment I hung up that phone, and I know now that she will never leave me alone. I thought that offering up my housemates might help. But it hasn't.